It says, explain why the price elasticity of demand is generally a negative number, except in the cases where the demand curve is perfectly elastic or perfectly inelastic. What would be implied by a positive price elasticity of demand? So again, for this question, we are going to have to know one of the main equations, and that's price elasticity of demand. And so what that refers to is going to be the idea that if equation is given by change in quantity or percentage change in quantity. What does that change in quantity? Change in quantity over change in price. So how does a change in price impact quantity demanded? And so why is the price elasticity of demand generally a negative number? And we're going to address that first. It's because price changes and quantity changes almost always for demand are going to operate in opposite directions. If price goes up, the law of demand tells us that quantity demand is going to go down. And if price goes down, the law of demand tells us that quantity demanded goes up, right? This is the law of demand is how demand curves work. And so if price goes up, that means the change in price has to be positive and the quantity change has to be negative. So a negative divided by a positive number is going to equal a negative number, right? Price decreases means that the change in price is going to be negative. Quantity increases means the change in quantity is going to be positive. Therefore, we're going to have a positive over a negative number, and that's going to give us a negative number. So in almost all scenarios, we see that the relationship holds that price elasticity is going to be negative. And that's because of the law of demand. So we call this law of demand. So then it gives us some exceptions, except in the cases where the demand curve is perfectly elastic or perfectly inelastic. So if we have perfectly elastic, we're going to have a curve like that. We're going to have perfectly inelastic. We're going to have a curve like this, right? So, sorry, I'm not sure why this is right there. Okay, so why is that the case? Well, we know that when we have a perfectly inelastic curve, no matter what happens, well, there's going to be no change in price, basically. Price never changes. So price change is always equal to 0. And that means that inelasticity is always going to be undefined here. Elasticity equal to something divided by 0, which is equal to does not exist. And then perfectly inelastically, we see that the change in quantity is always going to be equal to 0, right? There's only one quantity being produced. The quantity of demand is constant, is at all times, no matter what the price is. So we're going to get elasticity of demand is equal to 0 divided by something, and that's going to give us 0. And so in these cases, elasticity is neither positive or negative. One does not exist, and 0 is not negative. And so those are the exceptions that we see. And so again, this law of demand explains why most of the time we find a negative, and then the specific calculations in unique circumstances of perfect elasticity or perfect inelasticity are going to cause us to understand the rationale for why it's not necessarily always negative. Finally, what will be implied by positive price elasticity of demand? Positive price elasticity of demand would imply that the law of demand is broken, right? That as a price goes up, you would see quantity demanded go up, or that as price goes down, we see quantity demanded go down. One thing that we can see here is if price goes up and quantity demanded goes up, this is what we might think of as a luxury good, right? The idea that a high price indicates, I don't know, value or prestige or recognition. And so actually, by increasing the price of something, you make people want it even more. However, in real life, this only holds for maybe a little bit of the spectrum. At the end of the day, if you increase price by too much, the quantity demand has to go down. Another way that you might have a positive price elasticity demand is if price decreases and then quantity demanded decreases. And again, I don't think there's any version of this where that's true. I'm trying to think, but I don't think that's true. And so, right. So we wouldn't see that being the case here. So that would be basically the implication of a positive price elasticity demand is that you find a good where the law of demand does not apply, which is not the case for any good. So let's take a look at what the answer provided by the previous tutor says. So the previous answer says, price elasticities are almost always negative, although analysts tend to ignore the sign, even though this can lead to ambiguity. That's true. Normally, when we talk about elasticity, we use absolute value signs. So it's going to look like something like that. So absolute value would make it positive. That's just something to keep in mind. That's sometimes the notation. Only goods which do not conform to a law of demand, such as Veblen or Giffen goods. Oh, Giffen goods, right? That's what it was called. Great on this tutor for remembering. Have positive PAD. Yeah, so that is true. Veblen and Giffen goods are the names of the two goods that would fulfill these two conditions, where either there's a increase in price that allows quantity to go up as well, or a decrease in price which allows quantity to go down as well. It's a great answer. In general, the demand for a good is said to be inelastic or relatively inelastic when the price elasticity is less than 1 in absolute value. That's true. Not necessary to answer this question, but good knowledge. And that means that changes in price have a relatively small effect on the quantity of the good demanded. The demand for a good is said to be elastic or relatively elastic when its price elasticity is greater than 1. That is, changes in price have a relatively large effect on the quantity of the good demanded. That's true. That's just the definition of quantity. The equation. I think the one thing that this answer choice doesn't do very well is that explaining why the price elasticity of demand is generally a negative number. They do mention the law of demand, but don't necessarily do this breakdown that we do here. So we're just going to do that and make this answer choice just a little bit better. So let's take a look. So we say the law of demand tells us that as price increases, as a goods price increases, the quantity demanded decreases, and vice versa. Price elasticity of demand. So we can say, in other words, price and quantity always always change in opposite directions. Price elasticity demand is given by the formula percentage change in quantity divided by percentage change in price. And so as a result, for the majority of goods which fulfill the law of demand, the inverse relationship between price and quantity means that the elasticity of demand will be negative, regardless of the direction of change. Yeah. Price elasticity. So let's take a look just to make sure we got it all right. Law of demand tells us that as a goods price increases, the quantity demanded decreases and vice versa. In other words, price and quantity always change in opposite directions. Price elasticity of demand is given by the formula percentage change in quantity divided by percentage change in price. As a result, for the majority of goods which fulfill the law of demand, the inverse relationship between price and quantity means that price elasticity demand will be negative regardless of the direction of change. So that's going to kind of fill in a little bit of the gap in this answer choice. But other than that, this answer choice does a great job of